that work? Yep, great. So I suppose we may as well get started here. Um, Welcome everybody to the Lower Nehalem Watershed Council speaker series. Tonight we have Chris talking to us about process-based riverscape restoration. But before that happens, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what the Watershed Council has been up to by featuring one of our recent projects that we're working on. Quickly, we're the Lower Nehalem Watershed Council. Our mission is to protect, preserve, and enhance the Nehalem watershed through leadership, cooperation, and education. We do that in the Lower Nehalem watershed, which is defined as all the waters or all the area that is drained by the Nehalem River downstream of the confluence with Humbug Creek, which is right about in this vicinity. So that includes all of the Salmonberry River, all of the North Fork Nehalem, and then everything draining into the Nehalem itself downstream of the Humbug Creek confluence. What we do is we work with the variety of stakeholders in the watershed to restore and enhance habitat for fish and wildlife. We tend to primarily focus on coho because coho are a great keystone or indicator species. They use all of the watershed, and so from up in the headwaters and small beaver ponds all the way down to rearing in the estuary. And so with that in mind, we cover quite a bit of area. So tonight I'm going to be talking quickly about the Nehalem River Ranch riparian enhancement. It's a project we've been doing with the Nehalem River Ranch, one of our local beef ranches. And it's a neat project despite being on the surface just a riparian enhancement, because of some of the stuff we're doing in it around flash grazing to control Japanese knotweed, as well as trying to control knotweed enough to get conifers established in that riparian to thin out the knotweed through shading in a 30, 40, 50 year kind of timeline. So this is a map of the site. And as you can see, it's quite substantial. It's in fact 1.5 miles of planting. And you'll see that we have some areas marked out for grazing. And those areas, what's going to happen is once the trees are a bit more established, they were planted 2 seasons ago now. And once those trees are a bit more established, we're going to allow the cattle to actually flash graze through. And they've been trained already or given access to Japanese knotweed and have developed a bit of a taste for it. It's highly nutritious. It's a good feed for cows. And so we're going to allow them to move into these areas, graze on the knotweed to help keep it suppressed, while also doing manual knotweed suppression on the rest of the reach. The farm is in fact it's moving towards an organic certification. So an herbicide approach wasn't appropriate in this location. In addition to that, this is not a place where we're ever going to eradicate knotweed, just because of its position within the watershed and the volume of additional knotweed inputs from upstream. So every time it floods, new fragments of knotweed get washed up throughout this area and put down roots and establish. So spraying herbicide along 1.5 miles of river with the intention of eradicating knotweed was never an option that was even particularly on the table. So our goal is to just get trees established through the knotweed and keep it down long enough that the knotweed can get up, or that the conifers that we're planting can get up above it and provide some shading, thin it out a little bit, and provide some opportunity for more native plants. The other neat feature of this project is that in this section A up here, we are actually doing what's called a silviculture planting. And so a silviculture planting is a widely spaced planting with native plants intended to provide additional habitat for birds and pollinators encourage a wider variety of grasses. And so they'll be having more cool season shade tolerant grasses growing in that area, which provides for a wider variety of forage for the cows and goats that are on the property. And so up there, it's kind of the trees are spaced out about 30 or more feet apart, with the intention of then them developing, being thinned a little bit, and then providing some of that structure and habitat and forage for birds and pollinators, while also adjusting the forage options for the cows. Here's a typical stretch of the river through this area. You can see there are some trees still present along the bank, but this is a stretch of knotweed here, and this knotweed goes all the way down to the bank, and it's just incredibly dense, and this is very common for anybody who's familiar with the Nehalem along a lot of our river. Just there's a lot of knotweed. It's a persistent issue, and so our thought was, hey, let's try and get some trees established through it, even though we know we're never going to get rid of all of it. So here's another portion. All this blank area, all this empty area through the riparian here, all that area was knotweed, and the knotweed will be back this spring and summer. But you can see that we have, some good growth, some nice little leaders on these spruce trees that we planted. And there's a pretty substantial mix. We have spruce, cedar, and hemlocks in this planting for conifers, as well as a variety of understory species as well that we're trying to establish. Moving on, that's the wrong direction. Moving on, we also have this other area here that I thought was fun to point out. Oh, come on, why is it cruising along so much? There we go. Interesting area to point out, because you can see the thick band of knotweed right in through here, and it runs a little bit in under the canopy. And then once you get under this large spruce, and there's actually a cedar mixed in here as well, but once you get underneath this large conifer canopy, it really thins out kind of immediately. And so that kind of was part of the inspiration for this idea that maybe if we can get substantial conifers established in this reach of river, we'll be able to shade out some of the knotweed and reduce its density, and potentially, in that case, have a 150-year-ish break before the knotweed comes back into that area. It's going to come back until the upstream sources are all eliminated, but if we can provide good habitat features in this location, additional shading for the river, better infiltration of water into the water table, forage for wildlife species, and also some of that good nutrient absorption off the fields as well. So we can get all of these services out of a good riparian buffer, even without getting rid of the knotweed entirely in this location. And then this is another pre-project photo. And here's that same spruce and cedar tree right in here. And you can see the posts for all the little silviculture plantings that happened. And so they're spread out, again, with the idea of providing some of that nutrient cycling, habitat feature, et cetera, on this site. So all in all, it's a pretty cool project. We're pretty excited about it. And the whole flash grazing technique for controlling knotweed is one that we haven't encountered anywhere before. So we're trying to keep pretty good records of our starting point and the progress that we make through this project to see if maybe this is something that can be applicable in other agricultural properties where they have access to cows that can be fed on knotweed for a while, get them excited about it, and then flash them through a field where there's knotweed so they don't impact the riparian plantings. No discussion of a project is complete without thanking the people who've been involved. Obviously, the Nehalem River Ranch is our first partner on this and the most important one to mention because they're the landowner. And they're also managing the cows and the goats when we get around to the flash grazing. They're going to be managing, making sure that the timing is not too intense so that the cows and the goats don't end up in the planting areas for too long and impact the growth of our plantings. I also need to thank the Backyard Planting Program. They are a regional group that does a lot of our riparian plantings. They're supported through the DEQ, Department of Environmental Quality, and they do a lot of really great work in the area. They're also housed within Tillamook Estuaries Partnership, which we also partner with, and who will be providing some additional fiscal support for this project a little bit further down the line to keep up our maintenance work. It's also important to make note of the Northwest Oregon Restoration Partnership, also known as NORP. NORP is a tree nursery that we have here in Tillamook County, and they harvest all of their seed and propagules from the area so that we have locally adapted plant materials for our riparian work. And then finally, Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board for funding the project. Thank you everybody for listening to me. If there's any questions, I can grab a question or two before we move on to Chris. And if not, y'all didn't come here to hear me talk. So yeah. Any questions?
I have a question, Zach. About you said the knotweed is keeps reinvading by being coming downstream. So is there any hope of trying to address the source as opposed to you just being the victims, the downstream victims forever, as you talk about? So
there are examples of really great knotweed treatment programs that have happened in other locations. One of the ones that I like to bring up is Cedar Creek outside of Seattle, or in the Seattle area, rather, where they had a knotweed issue. And over the course of, I think it was over a decade and a half, they had a very focused program that started at the highest known incidence of knotweed in the watershed and used herbicide application annually, starting at the top and going as far as their budget would allow each year. And every year they would go back up to that first incidence that they knew of and start there and move down. They make it a little bit further every single year. And that's kind of the only approach that I'm familiar with that actually is effective at getting knotweed out of a watershed. And then it relies on there being no new propagules being moved in. It doesn't reproduce well from seed, according to my understanding. It is mostly vegetative reproduction. And so we would have to, I mean, the Nehalem's a much bigger system than the Cedar Creek system is. And Cedar Creek had the benefit of being largely municipally owned. And so they could kind of do whatever they wanted with it. It's going to take a concerted effort and a lot of will on the part of the community to address it in that fashion here. And I stand willing to help coordinate. And I think we're slowly building towards that. We've had some talks with some of the county soil water conservation districts about it. But ultimately, the big effort is going to be a large education and citizen engagement program to make that happen. And it's going to have to be sustained for it's probably a 20-year minimum fight, is my guess. Because Cedar Creek was so much smaller and it still took them over a decade to do it. But yeah, there's a pathway. And it's also worth mentioning that the Nehalem was one of the locations that the Oregon Department of Agriculture did some biocontrol releases in. And so we now have a species of knotweed psyllid, which is a small sap-sucking insect that is very specific to knotweed. And we will see if they are effective at reducing the vigor of Japanese knotweed in our region. It might be a more effective tool in the valley than it is over here on the coast, just because the coast stays so cool year round. And so that has not been tied to, cool temperatures have been tied to the psyllid having fewer life cycles through annually, as well as just less vigor. And so we'll see if that is a tool that ends up being helpful out here. I'm hopeful it will be, because it'd be nicer than having to try and rustle up the support all the way up and down the watershed. That's a pretty big effort. Well, with that, I'll pass it over to Chris. Thank you so much.
All right, let's see if I can share my screen, get that going.
You're shared. You can see it.
Okay. I just want to do that so I can see as well. All right. Does that still work?
Yep, it looks good.
Okay.
Though we're seeing your individual slides, not a slide up at a time.
Okay. All right. Hang on.
No worries. I do this every other presentation, I feel like, you know?
All right, try again. It's always a different combination. All right, now.
Nailed it. That's perfect.
How's that? Okay, all right, so we should see my title slide. I can see myself and my slides. So I'm gonna get going. Okay, thanks for the opportunity to talk with you all. Thanks for those making it in virtual person. And also, since recording it, then the future viewers. I'm going to talk about process-based riverscape restoration. And it's pretty much just stream restoration, but there's some differences. There's thinking about it in a process-based, and I'll talk about that. And there's thinking about it in a riverscapes way, not just the streams and the river reaches, but more the entire riverscape, which is the context of the stream reach. And generally that means the floodplain. So wherever the water, whether it's on the surface or the hyperrheic water associated with a stream or a river, how that affects the physics, how it affects the biology, that's the riverscapes. And that's, we have dramatically changed, and that's where the restoration part comes in. So let's talk about that. We have lots and lots of examples of impaired stream and river conditions, places where we have simplified it. We've moved the water away. We've added cows. We've degraded the shape and the form of the channel. We've decided to tell the channel what shape and form it should be without necessarily asking if it appreciated that or not. And in some cases, it's pretty extreme. It's pretty easy to see and to say, this is not a healthy riverscape. And it's kind of easy to see in the perfect, the good, really good examples. This is a healthy riverscape. It's not just the stream and the river channel, it's the entire floodplain is connected. It's all part of the river. So what are the elements of a healthy riverscape? How do you know it when you see it? If it's not as forehead slappingly obvious as this particular image I'm showing you from Colorado. So what are the elements? What are the elements of a healthy riverscape? And I'm not talking about restoration here. We're just talking about identifying those elements, and then we'll get to thinking about how do you restore to that. So space. A river, stream needs space. The riverscape, that's the space that water, that biology, that the physics occupy. And to be healthy, that space has to be there and has to be accessible, has to be available. The riverscape needs structure. That structure forces complexity. A simplified system is an impaired system, generally because it doesn't have anything to force the complexity. As a result of having space and structurally forced complexity, the third and probably the most critical component of identifying a healthy riverscape is flow inefficiency. A healthy riverscape does not move water down valley well, and that's good, because that water then has a lot of time to do other things than just move down valley. So those are the three elements of a healthy riverscape: space, structure, and flow inefficiency. So what does that look like with respect to restoration? So here's a cartoon example of a really cool project that I'll talk a little bit more in a bit. This is Doty Ravine Creek, which is near Chico, California, Sierra Foothills tributary in California. And this was a creek that has plenty of space, except it didn't have access to its space because of the anthropogenic influence of levees, dikes, holding that creek into a single threaded channel in what it was its historic process space. So this is the space of the current riverscape. This is the space of the historic riverscape. Notice that this looks like a pretty high efficiency transport channel. It's simplified, it's straight. It doesn't have a lot of stuff in it. There's not a lot of complexity. These things go together. You don't get one without the other. The physics and the biology are linked, and that's again another manifestation of a healthy riverscape is those components, that space, flow and efficiency, and structure, reinforce each other. So the intervention here was simply allowing this creek to reoccupy the space of its historic floodplain. Then the biology took over. So the physics was released into this entire space, which allowed the biology of that released stream to take over, and in the form of riparian vegetation, the water table being able to become closer to the surface, so supporting riparian vegetation that would allow beaver to come back to build beaver dam, which then makes the flow inefficient, puts structural complexity in the channel, and you end up having this fully connected floodplain where the riverscape is now occupied by that stream. So these three legs of the stool, as some people talk about it, or a triangle, are this space and structure and flow, and it's a balance between them. And when something gets out of balance, that's sort of that location of that place is out of the middle where all of these things get to play. And so the diagnosis of a riverscape impairment from a process standpoint tends to be, where is this riverscape currently in this process space, and where could it be with some restoration, or where in the sense, where should it be? Okay, well, what's the most common, if those are the three things, flow inefficiency, space, and structural complexity, that's a pretty short list, which sounds like it's pretty easy to identify. I'm going to shorten the list even further, and so the most common sort of missing element in a healthy riverscape is hydraulic roughness, is structural complexity. So it's just one thing that we have done or that we need to undo, redo in terms of restoration. And that is put that system back into connection, the physics and the biology in connection, through structural complexity, through roughness in the channel, not necessarily on the floodplain, but in the channel, such that that single channel connects with the floodplain and possibly makes multiple channels. And we're not even talking about single channels with roughness elements in them. Now we're talking about structural complexity and that structure forcing all of those multiple flow paths, which makes things inefficient and allows the vegetation, energy dissipation across the entire surface of the floodplain. Those are the elements of the processes that are intact in a functional riverscape. So riverscapes are much more like ribbons than they are like lines. We draw lines for rivers on maps. We obsess over the location of the blue line in our GIS work, but in reality, that we should be thinking of these sort of sausage or ribbon networks where we don't really even care where the channel is, because that's an artifact of us simplifying riverscapes to the point that there is a single channel that is in the same place over and over, such that we can map it, as opposed to being a wetland corridor. The Ellen Walls, a geomorphologist in Colorado, terms river networks. So flowing wetlands. Very different conceptualization of what a river net looks like. But that's the riverscapes thinking, and that's thinking about the processes that are intact. Now, clearly we can't have that everywhere. We have occupied floodplains. Our infrastructure, our industry exists in floodplains. But if we are thinking about restoring all of the processes, and I'm going to talk about what's the value of process-based restoration, what do you get from restoring these processes, we have to be aware that these functional, healthy systems require that space and the flow inefficiency. And all of it comes from that structural complexity that is the biological component of the system. That means we have to reimagine what these riverscapes look like, that they're not single-threaded channels, they're not blue lines, they are a mess. They're big, they're wide, they're unpredictable in terms of exactly where some part of it's going to be, but they're really predictable in the fact that the entire floodplain is connected all the time. And that's just a different view, a different imagination of what riverscapes should look like, can look like again. So there's some academic thinking models around this process of degradation and this process of that we need to, in a sense, reverse from a restoration standpoint. Probably the most widely used in the last decade or so is the work from Brian Kluwer and Colin Thorne, the Kluwer and Thorne channel evolution model, which gives us these terms, a stage 0 term, which is this reference condition. These are cross sections of channels in a forested or a grassland or sedge area, where the entire floodplain is occupied by the stream or river, and there are multiple channels or moving laterally migrating channels, and the water table is shallow. There isn't a defined abandoned terrace in a sense, except that in most cases we do have that because of this degradation cycle. And this is the channel evolution model from Kluwer and Thorne, is thinking about how have we degraded systems, how have they fallen apart, and what is missing, and what would we have to put back in terms of processes, not form, but in terms of processes, in order to recover the stage 0 or close to it, like stage 8. And so they've told the story with this channel evolution model that there are predictable stages of degradation that can be documented and described. They have particular states and functions and lack of function. And then what's it going to take to move on to this next state? And some of them are zombies. These are zombie states, stage 2 and 3. Yes, or these are rivers that are in these conditions are out of possibly a natural evolution where they could restore themselves, and they need intervention in a sense from us. The non-zombie rivers that are not stuck possibly can become reconnected and re-engage the fully reconnected floodplain. But in order to do that, they need to rebuild a baby version of themselves. And this is where you get down in the sort of stage 5, which is also known as an inset floodplain, where a smaller version of a connected floodplain exists in a lowered surface that has been carved out of the historic surface, that actually that allows deposition to happen again, aggradation to happen. This simplification part of this channel evolution model tends to be the concentration of energy of these multiple channels into a single channel, which takes a deposition environment and turns it into a transport environment, which then erodes the material that has been deposited to form the floodplain, moves it someplace else, and cuts down away from that space, isolating the channel from its lateral space and removing that one component of a healthy system, which is access to space. And the stream or river does it to itself once it's perturbed to the point where it can enter into this higher energy state of having a simplified channel. And we do that by removing some of the elements that allow it to have energy dissipation. That's removing some of the vegetation. We also do it by thinking that all of these channels are really inefficient, which they are, and we want the water to move more quickly through the system, so we concentrate it into a single channel, which turns it into a transport system, and it downcuts. And so this restoration part of returning this channel to its surface means in a sense refilling that trench, and we'll talk about that in some of the restoration approaches of moving a lot of earth in order to quickly restore and reconnect this floodplain. Another way to think about this is work from Janine Castro and Colin Thorne, the stream evolution triangle. So not so much a cycle, but again, this sort of three-legged stool about where a stream is. Is it dominated by the hydrology? Is it dominated by the geology? Is it dominated by the biology? Or is it in balance? And in a healthy system, as all these pieces are in balance. And notice there's 3 ways that I'm talking about how to describe a healthy riverscape. They're not inconsistent with each other. They're all useful for you and for me to think about and talk about this. And whichever one seems to resonate with you, use it, think about it. The bottom line is these are multiple elements that are in balance in order to get a functioning healthy system. And an impaired system has some obvious imbalance in these components of the components of the physics and the biology. And the physics comes from the geology and from the flowing water from the hydrology, and the biology comes in terms of the plants and animals that are in a sense growing in that floodplain and pulling energy out of the system, or resisting the flow energy of the gravity for the flowing water. So some examples using Janine and Colin's stream evolution triangle to describe some systems. There are natural examples that are stuck in these corners. So here's the Colorado River in the canyon section. Its form and its function is clearly dominated by its geology. Here's one of the classic rivers in New Zealand that is known for this braiding anastomosing channel that moves continuously. And in this case, the hydrology is completely describing where and when channels are, where they are. And then this is a natural system. This is basically a huge alluvial fan system, high energy, moving lots of alluvial material. And here's the Rio Negro, a tributary to in Brazil, tributary to the Amazon, and its form and function is completely driven by this flood ecology forest that sets up the channel structure. And so the extremes exist, but in general, when we think of a braiding in that wandering occupied floodplain system like this example here from the Ukraine, it's when the physics of the river and the biology are in this balance, and sort of our location in this space is somewhere away from those three corners. Okay, so why would we want to do this? Why would we want to entertain process-based restoration thinking, and how do we use those models, or the sort of those thought models that I just shared with you? Well, I want to talk about a little experiment that we did in Central Oregon to get at the why, because we were convinced, and this is colleagues at NOAA and Oregon State and University of Utah and some consulting companies over a decade or so working in the John Day and Bridge Creek in Central Oregon, asking the question, if you were to restore the processes in a creek, how would it biologically respond? And so here's a section, an overhead section before restoration and here after. And notice the elaboration of the water expressed on the surface. So in a sense, there's a single threaded channel here where we wouldn't expect one to be. And in restoring it and connecting to the floodplain, you have not any one single flow path. Okay, so we made a mess out of the system. But what did that do physically and biologically, and why is this, why from a biological objective? So Zach started off motivating what the Watershed Council is doing because of thinking about coho recovery and how you would provide a more productive reaches, whether it's for spawning or for rearing for coho. That's going to come from an intact functional riverscape, not just particular features that might exist within the watershed. So how does that work? How do we get more biological function out of a system through restoration? Well, this surface water extent is the most obvious thing. So here are some traces. The white is farther back in time. The gray is intermediate, and the black is more recent. So 2005, 10, and 14. This is in a treatment area, and the treatments are encouraging beaver, or actually building beaver dams ourselves, beaver dam analogs, that's adding structural complexity to the system and then letting the physics of the system take over, relative to a control reach where those treatments were not added, but we followed those reaches. And you see, as you wouldn't expect, that no real change in the surface water expression when you're not adding structural complexity. Some beavers did wander into the site, so we did get a little elaboration towards the end of what we were following, but that wasn't our treatment. That was just noise in the system by beavers wandering into a control area. Okay, so what now you have more water on the surface. Well, it certainly changes the riparian vegetation, especially in the high desert in Oregon, where access to water is going to change the vegetation from xeric to mesic. So we can see that from space in terms of how green and wet vegetation is farther away from the channel once you push water up and out. You store water in the ground. We had monitoring wells, and we got 25, 30 centimeters of water stored throughout the entire floodplain area, that floodplain volume, by piling the water up and allowing it to have more time to infiltrate and more access laterally. So that structural complexity piles water up. There's a vertical connectivity, but also that drives lateral connectivity by pushing water out as well. Pushing water up and out and down into the hyperrheic zone changes its temperature. And so you can see that really simply. Here's some temperature loggers that were in a simplified reach, and here's some temperature loggers that are adjacent to beaver dams. And this is hot summer days where the temperature is cycling, from 12 degrees at night to 25, 26 degrees in the daytime Celsius, and it's all the same in a simple unconnected, unrestored area, but in a more complexified area with more structural complexity, things in the channel, in this case beaver dams, whether they're functioning or they're abandoned. This is an abandoned dam. the temperature traces here look really different. Many of them are showing this similar pattern of this free stream temperature varying strongly from day to night, and others are showing what looks like groundwater or hyperrheic water at just 11 degrees in the channel, independent of the solar loading, the day and night cycle, and everywhere in between, which is the mixing. And that mixing is only possible, and this temperature modification is only possible because of the structural complexity. And this forcing of water from the surface to underground, clearly it is an energy exchange, because it's moving, it's taking that solar loaded water and getting it underground in contact with cooler substrate. So there's an energy exchange, but it's also taking oxygen and nutrients that are in the surface and moving them into that space where they can go through drive biological processes. And so what this does in a simplified reach, so here with no complexity, or a reach with just indicated here in this cartoon by having more vegetation nearby, but the idea is that there's going to be more complexity in the channel. You are going to slow down the movement of water, which increases the time for biological processing. And this is represented by these nutrient cycles, these spirals. They are closer together because the water is slowed down in a more complex area. But what also happens is these biological cycles, the sort of nutrient cycles, happen by microorganisms that live in biofilms on the surface of substrate. And if you are not forcing water down into the hyperrheic zone, into that substrate that's below the surface, the only bioprocessing is going to happen is just in that sort of surface layer of substrate. But if you're driving water down below the surface, you're allowing that water and everything it's carrying to access more biofilms, more volume of that biofilm, and therefore allowing more biological processing to happen. And what's the big deal about this biological processing? Well, this is the basis of the food chain. This is the decomposer cycles. These are the sort of nitrification and denitrification cycles. This is taking atmospheric or inorganic materials and making them accessible to plants and animals by making organic compounds. This drives the productivity. And so as a result, these areas are more productive. And you can see that in the fish. If we're measuring, in this case, juvenile Omicus, red band trout or steelhead, just depending what they decide to do as teenagers. But if we look at them as juveniles, in the areas that are treatment, those are in blue, and there are controls, which is an adjacent creek, before and after the restoration. The left is before, the right is after. In abundance, there's 170% more fish, juvenile trout and steelhead, in these more biologically complex areas. Their survival increases. So not only are there more of them, but they survive seasonally, they survive better. And so this is not just the result of making more habitat structure. This is the, so they're not just surviving because they can escape predation. This is changing their growth rates. This is changing their access to food. This is changing their access to, let's just go back to here. Fish in this environment have no options about where to go to behaviorally thermoregulate. Fish digest and feed at different temperatures and sleep at different temperatures. And if you give them those options, because you've made this more complicated area, you have, in a sense, happier fish, and you have more productive, and so increasing survival, increasing growth rates. And so it's no wonder we have an overall higher biological productivity, because you've made this a more complex and productive environment simply by adding structural complexity, which then forces all these physical and biological processes. Okay, so how do you do that? So in this case, we added, that one example, the structural forcing was in the form of artificial beaver dams, but that's not the only way to do it. So oftentimes when we think about restoration, we think about it from, oh, there's something missing in the system. There should be wood. Let's add wood. the stream is moving, we should stop it moving because it really needs to stay here. We can stop it moving by putting wood in. So double duty. That's not thinking about what the overall biological function of a riverscape. That's solving an engineering problem using, in this case, biodegradable, locally sourced material. Restoration from a process-based restoration, from a riverscapes restoration, is asking those questions about what is missing from those elements of a healthy riverscape: access to the space, flow and efficiency, and structurally forced complexity. And that's going to take a different approach to thinking about to doing the restoration. So here we are back in Doty Ravine, the place we had the cartoon example of. This is pasture land. This is the process space of the creek when it was just this wide, when it was levied off. And remember, I said that the treatment was really to free the creek from the levees and walk away. And that's sort of what happened. But the difference between that process space before impaired and after in functional is enormous. But that's not the only thing that seems to have changed in this picture, right? This creek has moved from that simplified channel that was levied off to being fully engaged on the surface, and there's a lot more going on here. But that wasn't actually done with the restoration. Really, what the restoration was done was allowing the biology and physics to take over. And in this particular case, so that's going from dominated by the geology and the hydrology, remember those two corners of the stream evolution triangle, moving up towards the biology, letting biology start to play. And what does that mean in this case? Well, what that means in this case is letting the water out on the surface. It does geomorphic work. It moves sediment around. It moves water around. And when the creek, when Doty Ravine Creek was in that levied off simple channel, all of this geomorphic work was just moving stuff down the valley. Now that it is able to get out onto the floodplain, the geomorphic work is moving sediment and water around that then feeds the biology. And then the biological work can happen. And the biological work is simply growing willows in this case. Well, there's a feedback because more willows growing are more things that divide the flow path that rob energy from the flowing water. And if you rob energy from the flowing water, you change its velocity, you change its capacity to carry stuff. And that means it's going to drop more of its sediment, which is going to feed more of the biology. And you're going to have this feedback cycle. And that's the connection between biology and physics that is possible when the balance of those three elements in a healthy connected riverscapes happens. So what about in the Bridge Creek example that I talked about before? How is that chain broken? There were beaver there. There was a lot of willow growing. So the potential for biological work was there. There was plenty of geomorphic work. There's a lot of water moving and it carries a lot of sediment, but the balance wasn't possible because the unit stream power of a simplified single threaded channel was too large for the biology to resist it. So the structures that beaver could build or the size of the vegetation that lived there was not able to actually withstand the flow energy of that simplified collected channel. And so that's what our intervention was to try to overcome the inequality between the potential for geomorphic work and the potential for the biology to resist the geomorphic work. So putting those two things in balance, and we did that by making these sad-looking mimics of beaver dams, but really just to, on a short term, these are not meant to last. They are meant to shift the balance towards the biology long enough for the biology to take over. And once that's happened, these structures don't need to exist and don't need to be there. And so these are restoration approaches. And again, this is in a process-based thinking, is how do you push a system to the point where it can take care of itself? Because if you are doing form-based or engineering-based restoration and trying to provide a function or provide a form for your river or watershed, you're in it forever. This is not that's not a restoration that's not process-based. Maybe thought of as one and done, but it's not. It can't be sustainable. But if you are engaging the processes that exist, those biological and physical processes, and try to put them in balance, then you can do your intervention and walk away. So, all right, beaver dam analogs. That's not the only thing. That's one way of accomplishing, because of the size of the system, and because of what historically was the dominant component. So here are these valley spanning beaver dams now that control the physics of this creek, which then allow the vegetation to control the sediment dynamics, which affects where the water goes. That's now a system that's in balance, and that's a system that we can walk away from in terms of saying we need to have interventions. So what are we talking about? We're talking about letting the water do the work. That's the folks in the desert Southwest have been, Bill Zedek and company have wrote a book, Let the Water Do the Work. That's really the idea, is there's a lot of energy, a lot of mass, there's a lot of viscosity, so the ability to pick stuff up and carrying it, and the inevitability of gravity is an energy source to use for good. In a simplified system, that energy source is going to waste, in a sense. So if you can't have a simplified system and you're putting a structure in, so here's a structure that went in, looks like a sad little pile of pieces of wood that one or two people can carry with a post pounded in, but it was directed and meant to erode the bank, which recruited these alder, which were senescent and overly mature, too big for this spot, and now they're contributing to restoration because they've been recruited to the channel. So erosion is a natural process. Things move around. Deposition is a natural process. When some systems are bowling alley straight like this, and there is no structural complexity, material moves out of the system, and you cannot do aggradation work. However, adding structural complexity, again, sad looking things that don't look like they're going to last, and they aren't, but what they do while they're there is cause these hydraulic shadows, which this is a bar that was deposited after a single storm event. The single storm event, which did not destroy these structures, but it did move. This cobble is the competent particle size for this creek if there are no structural elements in the channel. If there are structural elements in the channel, it is no longer the competent particle size, and it stops moving, which means you have aggradation, which means you now have diversity of particle sizes. You now have sediment sorting, sediment deposition. You have velocity gradients. You have high velocity chutes over here, and you have eddies over here. All of those are things that the fish like. And so you are letting the creek, in a sense, make those things itself by adding structural complexity. Okay, you can add structural complexity in lots of different ways with these hand-built structures for systems that are small. If you're working in larger systems and you're looking, sort of facing that same question, higher energy, larger, more area, more water, how do you approach dealing with out of balance physics and biology? And this is where these ideas of valley resets and stage zero, you've probably heard these terms, that accomplish this kind of reconnected floodplain in a larger river system. This requires heavy machinery. This is once one major intervention to reset the grade and the channel form of a large river. This is on the main stem Wallowa, and this is a large area that historically was occupied by the river, but the river had been pushed over into a single channel in order to make the floodplain more accessible for, in this case, agricultural use. It's a compromise. Part of the floodplain will be given back to the river, and in order to do that, that requires excavators and bulldozers and dump trucks to move the material around that this large river moved around by itself once it was simplified. These aren't one or the other. Here is a stage zero project that has hand-built structures in it. So some of that structural complexity can be added with these smaller structures, but the regrading allows the water to now access and move and slow down enough that these small structures are appropriate, are doing their job in amongst. So this is not a one or the other. This is a site. These are site decisions about how to treat the out of balance physics and biology of a site. So if we go back to this channel evolution model from Clure and Thorne, and we think about it now from the restoration standpoint, there are these extreme simplified and degrading states that probably are more amenable to these stage zero process reset, heavy machinery, high tech, whatever you want to call them, based approaches. And there are other sites that have inset floodplains, so they are lower energy, and therefore are more amenable to these process-led, like beaver dam analogs and post-assisted log structures, that are multiple interventions, multiple small interventions to chase the system over time. And so this is dividing the world up into different types of degradation, different scales of energy, and then different ways of approaching it that are still process-based. It's not either or, and these are design decisions that are relevant to the site, but also relevant to how fast you want your responses. These one intervention, heavy machinery version, multiple intervention, hand-built structures are decisions that need to be made when you're entering into this discussion with the river. The discussion is with the river, how this is best done. So you're on this gradient, and this is a work in progress from the folks who have designed all of these methods, is to where are you in a small enough system that you can do it by hand, or you're in a large enough system you can do it with only with heavy machinery. Those extremes are easy to identify, but this gray area in the middle is what we're all still working on. How do we do this? How do we make the decision whether it's a mixture, like the one picture I showed you, or is it lots and lots of structures that are built over many, many years by hand in order to accomplish the same thing you could do by burning diesel in one summer? And do you draw, cross out some types of impairment and say you can't deal with them with hand-built structures? I don't know, and I think the jury's still out on that. But these are the kind of conversations that the design and sort of science side of process-based restoration is having with itself, is how do we use these two really cool sort of families of tools and tackle the same problem, which is process impairments, so lack of full riverscape functionality. No matter what, you're going to be getting at this at the riverscape scale. This is density and extent. This is not just one project on one migrating bend. This is a large area, not a length of channel, an area, right? This is the entire floodplain, and it's gonna look different, and it might look messy. And that's a good thing, because that inefficiency of flow comes from that messiness of the system. It's gonna take a long time, whether it's a one and done restoration with bulldozers that takes a while for it, in sense, to heal, or multiple interventions with the hand-built things. And so this is for low-tech process-based restorations or design principles. Individual structures are where you're acting, building individual BDAs or PALs, but you've never designed them as individuals. You always design them in complexes, 10s or 20s or 50s of them, and they have an overall project goal. And that is the spatial scale. So you're acting at the meter scale when you're doing the work, but your project is at the kilometer scale. And you're acting on days, but you're expecting your response to be on thousands of days. That's multiple years, because you are slowly pushing the system into a new process state. And the same is true with the heavy machinery, the high-tech process, the high-tech sort of process-based restoration, the alternative of the low-tech. So just some examples from the Nehalem, some places that where there is impairment in the riverscape function, And what do you think about in terms of how do you view it as impairment, and do you view it as then how do you approach this in a process-based way? So I can't see the audience. If this were alive, I would get a poll and ask whether people think the top or the bottom are in good condition or in bad condition. I love the bottom, and I see huge potential, but a lot of degradation in the upper. And a lot of people look at that upper panel and say, "Oh, you've got canopy closure. We're golden." But no, this alder stand should not have ever been able to get this old and this dense, and there's nothing growing on the ground because it's all shaded out by the canopy closure, which means the biological productivity of this area is greatly reduced. So what do you do about it, right? And how is this reach so much more open, and there's just dead trees, good dead trees there in that connected floodplain. And so here, beaver are just below, this open area, and are they going to and if since they have access to sunlight over here, which is going to grow food for them, they can start exploring into the forested area and hopefully remove some of these senescent, overly mature trees. Or you can hire someone with a chainsaw to come in and cut down all of the trees. Yes, cutting down all of the trees in the riparian forest is necessary to restore the function of these systems that don't have the biological, that are in a sense overly controlled by the biology. So remember, the biology and the physics need to be in balance. Letting the biology go wild is just like the Japanese knotweed problem that Zach started off. That is not a good case. The same thing, I'm sure you have reed canary grass infested reaches where reed canary grass controls the physics, and the physics of the stream cannot come back and do what it could have done before. So the balance can go both ways. An oversimplified channel can be too high energy, an over biology channel, generally with invasive species, or lack of natural biological components, in this case lack of beaver, gets the biology out of control. And the functional riverscape is when those things are in balance. And that's our job as restoration practitioners, is to identify those process impairments and make interventions, not make structures, not make form, make interventions that aim to restore that balance, and then get out of the way, because these systems have millions of years of practice of doing it themselves. So some pictures of what it looks like, what it can look like. Here's that single threaded channel I started off before by saying, why would you do this and how would you do this? And this is what it can look like when that channel is allowed now to occupy the entirety of its floodplain. And it's no longer a single channel. It is no longer, and where that channel is each year is really, really different depending on what the flow events occur. But as a result, it's a much, much more productive, and it's actually a safer system from fire, from flood control, and it stores water in terms of extending late season flows in terms of drought resilience. So these are more resilient, robust biological systems when we allow them to be intact, functioning riverscapes, which is why I think is the why we do this. And with that, I'm going to stop. And happy to answer questions for those of you who are here.
And anyone can feel free to put questions in the chat and we'll answer them from there as well. So I have one of my own. I made a note earlier on in your presentation when you were talking about and showing that little cartoon diagram that had the edges of the valley bed, right, with the entire floodplain and then the edge of that floodplain marked out. And what I was thinking is, okay, I see advantages in getting multi-braided channels. I try and create that with large wood placements all the time, right? But there's, for instance, in Oregon, we now have the private forest accords. We have these new buffers that are based off of, frankly, a single threaded channel condition, which in some of our Nehalem steep banked, creek valleys maybe works and makes sense, but in a wider floodplain scenario, um, you might be occupying more space, or if your channel is your center point for that buffer, that riparian buffer, how do you set that, and how do you accommodate a river or a creek that's going to move around throughout a floodplain in a regulatory framework?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, we have property boundaries that are set by the middle of the channel. And so then we get into left and right bank neighbor disagreements when the channel migrates, because it's giving someone land and taking someone else's land. And that's because we had, a silly idea a long time ago that that channel was going to stay in one place and that channel meant something, when in fact that valley floor was built by that channel, and that valley floor at any one time was occupied by any part of that channel. And so that's where I think we have this reimagining, remembering problem, where we have built into our way of life, our way of doing business, the fact that we can put roads right on the surface of the floodplain, not even elevating the roads, putting them right, using that nice alluvial material as a roadbed that is at flood level. And so the idea that we don't even imagine how it got there. How did that conveniently flat surface arise? And yeah, I think the riparian buffers is a great example where instead of saying how many, and it's site potential tree height, right? And we've turned that into feet, but we say it's one tree away from the channel, because a tree that's more than one tree away is not going to recruit, which isn't true because you have debris flows. But it's really where the slope break happens for that valley floor. And then the buffer is not the same size if you're using feet, but the buffer is exactly the same size if you're saying it's 1/2 valley width, because and the valley width depends, but that's what actually matters. And so there's nothing wrong with saying what's the area that should be given over to the creek. It's not going to be a unit of feet, it's going to be a unit of of valley widths, and we just haven't thought that way. But that's not to say it couldn't be. We couldn't cast all of our our regulatory framework in that. That would be a major remodeling, and so it's not necessarily going to be easy. But the other thing too is even thinking that those valley floors are anything but just wetlands. And if you think of them as wetlands, then we take them out of the forest entirely, and they are not a good place for roads because they're wet, and they aren't going to grow trees because they're wet, and we just let them be wet. And then they're valley bottoms that are different from upslope, but grow trees that we harvest. And so it's, again, we've dried them out and we've made them forests, but they aren't historically that way. Yeah, I'm just looking at the chat. Yeah.
Yep, great. And in particular to that question, like I have a particular site in mind where we do have a big wide valley bottom that is largely fine sediment deposition with a heavily incised channel that is now growing trees, and it's owned by a timber company. And so as I try and do work in that creek and reconnect that floodplain, I'm trying to find pathways for everybody to walk away reasonably happy.
Yeah, and there's a great question in the chat around, and I think it's a good question about sediment dynamics and dynamic systems. And I said messy in space, but messy in time. But it also brings up a point that it's sort of one of my pet peeves. If folks say the coast is different from the interior, right? Or this won't work on the coast, this will only work in the interior. Physics are physics, and ecology is ecology, and it works everywhere. And there are massive debris flows that happen in the desert, and they happen not from you know, rain or snow melt that you might happen on an annual cycle. They happen from, you know, like thundercell cycles that happen episodically, that deliver an enormous amount of water that moves an enormous amount of sediment. And so we have debris flow driven systems no matter where we look, whether they're landslides from slope failure that we think of as only in wet areas, or debris flows from fire-driven changes in sort of the vegetation ability to hold soil together, and fire is an issue everywhere, and high rain, high precipitation events that happen everywhere. So I think it's not really fair to say that there are different processes in different places. They might happen at different frequencies, but they certainly are going to be there everywhere. You bring up a really good point about big pulses of sediment that move into a system, and again, that's a natural process. A big pulse moves in, it's deposited where it lands, and then the system works its way, moving it through and down. And so again, we get back to, that's a problem only if we think this terrace elevation and this channel needs to be here all the time. And that's not it. That's just, then we're going to be disappointed. But if we allow those elevations and those locations to move laterally and vertically and be okay with that, then we're embracing those dynamics at large and small time and space scales that are in healthy functioning systems. And yeah, something might look like it's incising for a while because it's moving through a big plug of sediment that was released from a fire event or a storm flow event. But that's the raw material. That's the food for a riverscape. That material is what's going to allow that geomorphic and biological work. So systems that are starved from complexity tend to be starved of material upstream. And so wood-starved systems then simplify because there isn't a source of wood that would normally move through the system, and as it's moving through the system, cause energy dissipation and therefore cause deposition. So the some folks that I've talked to recently object to the riverscape thinking, even though the riverscape is drawn out from the channel and reach focus to the entire floodplain. These are fire ecologists, forest ecologists who say your happy riverscape is not happy unless it's fed by our forests, and our forests are burning and falling downhill all the time, and that's what feeds your rivers. And you, to your peril, ignore the fact that the dynamics is from the ridge tops all the way down, and that's true. And if we change that cycle by changing how we use forests, then we should expect impaired riverscapes downstream. Appreciate you asking me to talk about riverscapes and about process-based restoration. It's different. It's a different way of thinking. It's sometimes scary, but I do think we have to start spreading the word and thinking about what's our view of healthy systems, and what does it take to have a healthy system. It's easy to say, I want more coho, so therefore I want to do restoration, but then you realize, okay, but that means you need to end up with connected floodplains and riparian non-forests, riparian wetlands, and then all of a sudden you have happy coho habitat or more beaver, and those things. Like, wait a minute, I wanted coho but without all that mess. It's like, no, that all goes together. That's how the system is as productive as it could be.
You mind if I ask a direct question?
Please.
Great talk, and it was so fun to see your account of Bridge Creek. I knocked around there pre-restoration and post, and it's profound, doesn't do it justice.
And it's falling apart because we did an intervention, and it probably needs keeping more interventions because it's not really in the self-sustaining mode yet. And that's what we're also learning in this world, is that it's naive to think that a system that's been so impaired for so long, you can make certain parts of it better, and then that spreads out. That it's still able to fall apart. And I think we're going to see the same thing with these really cool stage 0 projects that are happening, through the Forest Service in the Willamette. It might be 50 years, but all of the wood that was put there on the floodplain that makes the structure, that's eventually going to fall apart and move away. And that recruitment process isn't intact. And so we are setting ourselves up for more work in the future, but it's not as fast as it would be if you're just saying, I'm going to put an engineered logjam here, and then you're going to have to replace it again. So yeah, it's really cool, the stuff that's happening, but I think we're still learning about how we have to keep pushing these systems.
Yeah, well, I mean, I really like the idea that, getting sort of enough structures in the system kind of fixes things. And it kind of doesn't, and particularly when these things have a lifespan, and if there is not the full suite of material and process to support a more desirable suite of states, you're not going to get a more desirable suite of channel states. If I have any sort of kind of questions about your talk, it's related to the concept of balance. And, I was trained as an evolutionary biologist, and I have a background in riverscape geomorphology. And I've always found that the idea of balance is for me, is one of the most pernicious ideas socially, culturally, and scientifically in understanding natural systems. And so, when I look at these West Side systems, and I don't know if you've ever knocked around Franklin and Harvey Creek and some of these places, these sort of iconic debris flow driven systems, down in the Umpqua, where Gordy Reese, Jim Siddell started out.
Yep.
So there's, lateral and vertical instability in these systems, and in between the sediment influxes, you're at bedrock, and the channels has lower function. And the only really problem I have with this concept of balance is when people go out with the idea that there's a balance in the way channels are supposed to be, you get more behavioral people are trying to shoehorn channels into particular states, if that makes sense. As opposed to understanding in a broad riverscape context, what are the important processes and elements, providing them and stepping back. And I think that we sort of agree in a broad sense, and sort of conceptually, maybe philosophically or religiously, we might take a different path on the use of the concept of balance.
Well, so I would offer that there's maybe two views of balance, and one would be a stable equilibrium, and the other one would be a dynamic quasi-stable equilibrium. And a stable equilibrium, people would say, is in balance. That the system, every time, it's like the flight stability control, structures that are on modern passenger airplanes. That as soon as you get a little bit of yaw, then you get a little, whoops, wrong finger, you get a little structure that pops up on this wing that slows it down, and it goes back like this. So it's self-correcting, right? So that is a stable equilibrium condition, design condition, and that's not how rivers work.
No,
right? Rivers are. If I could do this, if I could balance this lacrosse ball on top of this screwdriver, that would be balanced, right? That would be a very unstable equilibrium. Any perturbation would cause it to fall, right? And so both of those things are balanced. It's what happens when it's perturbed, and a resilient system has the ability to recover up to a certain point, and then it gets out of balance, right? And then it runs away. And often our perturbations on systems, or naturally resilient systems, are out of their range of ability to recover. And so we have these two pieces. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
yeah. I think
take
that's,
your point.
that's a good, and I think a useful concept. And I tend to see riverscapes as more like raw balls bouncing around rooms, oftentimes fully within their natural states, and not as a result of anthropogenic disturbance or disruption. And some of them are very much, there's a lot of different equilibria and non-equilibria states that channels occupy. And I think we can find examples of all of ones that I think might be natural, and or things that are sort of within a desirable range that a rational restoration person trying to achieve sort of natural process function would accommodate. So I spend a lot of time looking at the terraces when I'm in rivers, and I kind of think a lot about the Holocene, and things have looked a lot different at different times, and those dynamics and those dynamic disequilibriums are very common, right? And so that's just it's great work, and it's really fun. And thank you so much for showing up and talking. And it'd be fun to sit around, drink some beer, and talk about this stuff. But they're very important and relevant ideas, and we appreciate your help.
Yeah, and yes, I think pushing on it and us getting out and looking and thinking more, and the cautionary tales that come from the legacy sediment work on the East Coast, which is very relevant here. Incised channels masquerading, as or impaired channels masquerading as an incised channel masquerading as a elevated floodplain terrace because of sediment washed off the hillsides because of our human interventions over the last 300 years, and so looking at systems all across the Piedmont there and the coastal plain and the East Coast, seeing systems and saying, oh, they're incised, we have to reconnect by lifting the channel. But in fact, no, we have to excavate the entire floodplain. This is sediment that doesn't belong here. And there's so much sediment that's run off so much of the watershed that it's buried these depositional environments to the point that they look incised. And so that's flipping a problem, in a massive way, where you say, "Oh, I have a channel incision problem." It's like, no, you have a floodplain elevation problem, and that you couldn't even imagine. But it doesn't take long to know the symptoms to look for it and see that sediment that shouldn't be there.
It's interesting. So when I think of the East Coast, and I've done no work in the Piedmont, I think of low sediment production rates. I mean, natural, inherent sediment production rate.
Not if you removed every single tree off of every bit of the catchment plowed it all, and tried to grow corn, and then failed, and then after all the sediment washes away.
So that's a sediment yield, I would say, and sort of the production off the hill slope is low relative to our environment. If that's a distinction that rings, right? And so essentially you've mobilized a lot of old soil, you've buried these systems, and our sediment production rates of the Coast Range are astronomically high, and our sediment yield rates and uplift rates approximate the highest on Earth. And so we're operating in a domain of extraordinary sediment production and yield. We know from our watershed studies that, about 98% of sediment delivers to the channel, as you know, from debris flows to channel transport. And that's highly concentrated. And it takes about a generation of old growth trees to produce a new layer of soil in the Tyee sandstone or our siltstone here. And it's and so our systems have, at least since the mid-Holocene, have accommodated enormous volumes of sediment repeatedly. And but it's interesting. This is a great talk, and thank you so much thanks for being here.
Well, do we have other questions coming up for anybody? I'll give it a couple beats.
Count to 5.
Yep. I also want to express a lot of appreciation for you making time for this talk.
Sorry it was such a pain to schedule it. Zach has been chasing me for 6 months to get here. So
good job, Zach.
Sometimes I'm tenacious, sometimes.
Good.
But I really appreciate you making the time to be here for this, and really enjoyed the talk. And it, every time I encounter another talk on process-based restoration, approaches, I tend to walk away with like a bunch of stuff to chew on and think about, and I tend to spend a lot of time envisioning particular areas in the landscape, and thinking about how do these ideas apply there. And yeah, one of the things we were talking about with that thick alder patch struck me, just because we're actually looking at the density of alder in our riparian in general around here, and how much of that legacy of alder in the riparian zone is a result of stream cleaning, reducing the ability to maintain sediment, reducing the ability for, increasing velocities, reducing the ability for beaver to establish. How much of that is removing wetlands from those corridors, or alternately, how much stream cleaning removed nurse logs from those environments that then were growing conifers on low terraces in those environments. And so, like, there's several directions for processes to go in these areas, and I always walk with a lot to chew on, obviously.
I was going to jump in with a bit of a question. I'm with the Lower Nehalem Community Trust, and a lot of our holdings are basically in between the dikes of the highways and the estuary, and so you don't have the upstream feed of materials, and it's going to be decades before anything we grow is going to be substantial enough to be creating that wood in the streams. But we have, our flagship property has what appears to be an incised channel, and it basically is a pass-through, and I am struggling with how to get away from let nature take its course, and eventually it will develop into a system that I think the fish don't have that many generations.
Right. Yeah.
And so that stretch between the population and the estuary, where the natural processes are no longer functional. You want to comment on that a little bit?
Well, yeah, I think we have ignored the same kind of questions, on beach function and on estuary function. That these dynamics that we have tried to stabilize, or areas that we've think are wasted, and we should then levy off or dike off and use for something else, had an enormous service for the overall dynamics of the system, energy storage, material storage, and so just like the Salmon River restoration, there just south of Nesquin, right? That by Lincoln City, that's an amazing piece of collaboration between Forest Service and private property and land trusts in order to reimagine how that estuary could function, and it was more about restoring the estuary and less about the benefits to fish. But the fish story that emerged from that was mind-boggling, and that things that all of the experts said that coho and Chinook don't do, well, it turns out they do, and they still can remember how to do, if you give them that opportunity to be able to use that kind of an environment as another source, another alternative for another life history pathway. And so I think that, I would hope, could be the kind of inspiration that reconnecting, allowing more lateral connectivity in estuary areas, so that the river isn't just passing through, that it does have a lot more connection. And some of the cool work that's coming out of the Columbia right now, the Columbia estuary, where the value of estuary restoration was seen as if you have fish using your restored area, then it's a good project. And if you don't have fish using it, then it was a bad project. It wasn't actually functional. But what people are finding now is that those areas, even if they don't have fish in them, are exporting food. And so these are you know, the tidal flushing of you know, of these marsh areas are washing food out into the main channel. And an extreme example of that, even entirely in the freshwater environment, is in the Sacramento River, where the Sacramento is moved seasonally from, you know, reservoir down out to the delta, and not allowed to seasonally flood what was probably the largest, you know, seasonal wetland on the continent, the Central Valley of California, both the San Joaquin and the Sacramento system. But in a few places, seasonally reconnected floodplains are being shown to be enormously beneficial for Chinook as food factories, both if the fish get onto those seasonally flooded, in this case, rice fields, or if the water is allowed to sit on the rice fields and grow Daphnia, water fleas, that then flush back into the main stem, and the fish can eat it and eat all that food. And so the idea that there's no function for areas that just get wet seasonally is a failure of our imagination to imagine what all the biological processes are missing by just thinking the water needs to pass through. We need to get the water from here to there, and it doesn't do anything sitting on the land over here. And so getting that reconnection, just as it does in the streams, these are biologically productive areas, and you're just getting more area. It doesn't have to be, you know, good area. These are seasonally flooded rice fields. They don't look like a restoration project, but that's because we're not imagining that food web component of restoration that's happening there. And the same thing happens in our estuaries, so I think the idea of adding reconnection, that lateral reconnection in those lower ends of watersheds, is really valuable, even if it's just periodic, right? It's just, so high rain events or high flow events allow that, but that's washing food into the channel where maybe it's where fish actually can occupy it, if we're just focusing on fish. So, you know, that those kind of restoration projects are making the foodscape more intact, even if we don't think about the other parts of the riverscape are intact. And there's some really cool work that folks are doing in California on the eel, and then also in the Sacramento, on this idea of foodscapes and thinking about restoring the function of food webs, and how do we do that? I mean, it's making our lives more complicated in imagining the restoration, but, you know, any ability to do reconnection in that lower area has a huge potential to be biologically meaningful.
Well, one of the things I look at least, in thinking about what we're going to do with some of our properties, is not look at recruitment from upstream, but look at recruitment from drift logs. How can we design it so they get in and they don't get out, like fish traps, log traps?
Sure. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. And seeding, I mean, a lot of these sort of stage 0 kind of restoration is seeding the floodplain with a lot of wood. And maybe it moves around, maybe it gets used, maybe it does, but it's just putting wood on the surface, a surface that may be wet at some point, as opposed to saying, I'm only going to put a piece of wood here because I think it's going to do this tomorrow, as opposed to populating entire surfaces with material that would have been there.
And we have a nice little, I emphasize little, but a nice little place where we've got some real nice Sitka growth starting in an area. When you look at the 1934 aerial photographs, the driftwood is all stacked up in that area. And you walk through there and you can feel how unsteady that ground is because of the rotting logs. But the Sitkas are happy as can be, and they're just coming up like crazy in that area. But that's a long time to wait.
That's a long time to wait. Yeah. Yep.
All right. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks.
If you're ever walking the area, maybe I'll drag you down to our creek and bring my board along.
All right. Thanks, Zach.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much. And this talk will be up on YouTube if anybody wants to direct people towards it, including all the questions. And thank you again, everybody. I appreciate everybody coming, and we'll see you next time.